Here this week for the interview is Tony Reibel. Tony hails from Adlai Stevenson High School in Illinois and is currently the assistant principal for teaching and learning. Tony is also the co-author of several books about proficiency-based learning, proficiency-based assessment, instruction, proficiency-based grading. You name it, proficiency-based. Tony is all over it in the content areas and also pathways to proficiency. So a tremendous number of books. Tony is also an associate with our Solution Tree Assessment Center team, and we love having Tony as part of that team. His most recent publication is Small Changes, Big Impact, a collaboration he wrote with co-author Matt Thied. And that is where we're going to start today. So, Tony, great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to be here. Good to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. Great to have you back on the podcast. Now, full disclosures, listeners, I wrote an endorsement for the book that we're about to talk about. So it appears on the back cover of the book. So clearly, I'm a fan and I liked it. So happy to have Tony here to talk about the book because I loved some of the ideas. And we're going to dive right in to some of those topics in a moment. But I want to start, Tony, with your education journey. Before
Sure.
we get into the book, let's talk about your professional journey, the resumes, different roles you've held. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I was actually in the business world for a couple of years. Started off as a programmer and had a programming and a Spanish degree out of college, and I went the programming route and was there for a few years. But then I started coaching, and I said, I need to go be a teacher. So went to night school, worked full time, went to night school, got my teaching cert, and ended up at Stevenson. And I've been here 14 years. Started as a Spanish teacher, then moved to director of assessment, where spent a lot of time researching assessment work, and that's where the books came from. And now I'm assistant principal. So still teaching and learning, still same proficiency work, but now I do master schedule, which is the beast in itself. So, so that's it. Stevenson is, referred to often as the birthplace PLC. So, I live and breathe that every day, and I've been fortunate to be here for this long. So,
yeah. So 14 years, tell us a little bit about the culture of the school. Obviously, there's been a who's who of superintendents and administrators
Sure.
through the school. But during your 14 years, who might have been some of the major influences on you as you sort of grew into your role and have changed roles if you've been at that school?
Yeah, actually, my first year, Dr. Tim Kanold was superintendent.
Okay.
And he would speak during the, all staff days. And I was like, wow, this guy's impressive. And this culture of this school is alive and vibrant. And it was a really awesome experience my first year. A lot of energy here. A lot of people, I think more importantly, a lot of people rowing in the same direction, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just observable. You could feel it. But so that aside, I didn't learn a lot from Tim because he left the next year. He retired. And then Dr. Eric Twaddell became our superintendent and still is.
Yeah.
He's been an amazing influence on my career. I mean, writing those books, I remember him saying to me like, yeah, but how do you define it? And then I would say, somebody be like, no, define it more. Right. And he challenged my language, my ideas. And I think he, was a big influence on, my career and what I do now as an administrator. And with that, Troy Gobble is our principal. He's, presents nationally as well. And he's an amazing person and leader. And I've learned a ton from him. So, yeah, there's been, and Rick DeFore, he was here long before I got here, but, he came back and saw him speak and talked to him, and gave me some advice, just in the few moments I got to talk to him. But still, it was, this just who's who of leadership has kind of gone through this place. And I'm fortunate to have learned from him.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to mention that for those not familiar with Adlai Stevenson High School, that prior to Tim Kanold, Rick DeFore was the superintendent there as well. So Rick, who has sadly passed away, but with Tim and with Eric, there is a definitely a national profile at Stevenson that many of us are certainly aware of and inspired by, to be honest. So wonderful that you have a chance to sort of grow through the different roles in that school. Okay, let's talk about small changes, big impact. What was the motivation behind it? I read the book. I love the book. What was the motivation? Where did you and Matt get the inspiration for the book, and what motivated you to write it?
Yeah. So just to say, his last name is pronounced Tatey, Matt Tatey.
Oh, Tatey. I apologize
yeah,
to Matt.
it's a tricky one. So
Yeah.
Matt Tatey. So we were, so I was director of assessment. This was maybe, like 8 years ago at this point. And we were starting to move to an evidence-based grading model, which is, influence from you, read your book, grading from the inside out, and got a lot of ideas about, intervention and assessment. So there took a lot of information over those 8 years, and we started working on challenging our grading practices. And we were calling it evidence-based grading. So using evidence to judge proficiency in standards and give grades from that. Right. So Matt had visited in a site visit at Stevenson and came into my office after, and he's like, "Oh, I love this grading system. I want to do it at my school." So we had a 3-year collaboration online. I went out there a few times to talk to him and his staff. And he took the ideas and principles that we were doing here to make our evidence-based grading system work. And he implemented, within those 3 years, he implemented evidence-based grading in his high school and middle school. And I was floored and impressed. He took it from 0 to 100% in 3 years, and got buy-in from his staff, and was getting good stories from his students about how they liked it and it was beneficial and all this. So he called me up and he said, I think I've got an interesting story to tell about my journey through this, because we're in the middle of Iowa. It's a rural community. Change is not always welcome here. It's just, I think we did something special. And I said, all right, well, what did you do? And he's like, well, there's really 10 things I kept saying over and over and over again to my staff. And those were kind of like the 10 principles we followed. And those were the takeaways that he had from our work. And I said, well, let's give it a shot. And that's the story. So it was these 10 things, and we called them, he was referring to them as small changes that had big impact. And I know that, the title of the book, and, these small changes are, just perspective shifts, defining success as self-reliance and things like that. So that was really it. Just an ongoing 3-year collaboration, and he wanted to tell his story about how he had success with it. So
fantastic. Again, apologies to Matt. Listeners, you would not know this, but I was a little rushed in getting to this interview today, and as a result of that, of course, there's always an oversight. But I do apologize to Matt for mispronouncing his name. That's never fun to hear or have someone do that. It's interesting, Tony. I was going to ask you about that because as I read the book, small changes, I'm like, these aren't small. These are some fairly significant shifts in mindset. So again, maybe help me understand your perspective or Matt's perspective. Why are you referring to them as small changes? Because some of these, and listeners, you're about to hear this, we're going to dig into some very important topics. Why do you refer to them as small changes?
Yeah, and I think they're small changes in mindset.
Okay.
They're paradigm shifts in some respect.
Okay.
But it's a small shift. And that kind of came from my experience with these, right? Student achievement is not success. Student achievement is helping a kid become self-reliant. Mm-hmm. That's a small, shift in language, but it had huge impact on the way we approach teaching and learning and grading.
Right.
And Matt made those same shifts, let's look at success as that. I say to a lot of my staff and schools that I work with and teachers there, I say, don't consider yourself a math teacher or a science teacher. Mm-hmm. Consider yourself a teacher who uses science or math to build a self-reliant student and person. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's a small shift in language, just rearranging some words, but it has that, impact that we were looking for. So,
right. Right. So as you, yeah, and certainly a book that's called, Big Changes or Massive Changes, not going to sell very well.
Yeah,
People can look at that and go, I don't know about these big changes. 10 massive changes to your teaching practice, 10 ways to overhaul everything you do. That's probably not going to, but I want to pick up on that idea because you write in the book that too many schools equate success with achievement. Let's talk a little bit more intimately about this idea of self-reliance, resiliency, setting up for lifelong learning. You challenge that notion in the book, and you say that we need to redefine student success as something else. So tell us again how we redefine success and why that's so critical, why that's such a critical part of how a school can shift that paradigm.
Yeah, I think, one thing I said to our board last summer at our board meeting, I said, we have a proxy paradox, right? In education. We have metrics that stand in for success because they're easy to measure, they're efficient to measure. We can make somewhat logical assumptions about kids learning from those matrices. And I think, it's easy to stay and look at that as success, an SAT score or some trend scores on our final exam data. Those are easy to measure. It's hard to measure self-reliance. It's hard to measure advocacy. It's hard to measure some of the competencies, like how well you argue and make an argument. There's a lot of nuance to that that's hard to quantify. And we end up, I think, in education, and what we said in the book was we kind of sidestep that goal of building a self-reliant, sustaining person. I mean, Paulo Freire talks about in his research, like, he wrote back in the 70s and 80s, and he says that the goal of education should be to prepare someone for a self-managed life. And I love that phrase because that should be the goal. I mean, we have, 4 years with kids, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. And we have our expertise and our own efficacy and experiences that we can help kids learn how to become a person who can manage their life. So yeah, I think it's just, to me, it's a proxy paradox. I mean, we let things stand in for success because they're easy to measure. And I think it's time, in my opinion, that we move to, measuring some of the things that matter to that self-reliant individual. So
you got an idea or a strategy about how, so somebody listening right now is thinking to themselves, okay, I'm with you, Tony. Let's look at self-reliance. Let's talk about those things that truly matter. Can you give us maybe an example or two of, a way that you might do that?
I think, well, as far as mission statements or as far as your
no, as far as the idea of how would we measure that if we need to change how we define success and we need to measure what matters? What are some ideas about how we might do that?
Yeah, I think one of the bigger things is to make your grading, meaning give grades that represent competency in skills that connect to self-reliance.
Okay.
Let me talk about that for a second.
Sure.
So our grading system, each of our courses has between 3 to 5 skills that kids have to master to get an A, B, C, D, depending on what their level of mastery is. Right. But those skills are connected to that idea of self-reliance. So math class is simplify, solve, analyze, create representations. And you talk about it in your books, and Cassie Erkins as well. Like, we want endurance, leverageable, transferable skills to kind of lead our curriculum and grading. And when we started our change, that was the key connection to that idea of self-reliance. Is we don't want to give grades off of situational learning or, situational content and averaging all that together, because that doesn't necessarily connect to that idea of building a self-motivated, self-sustaining person. So, but the skill of argumentation is in our science class, in our social studies class, in our English class, and kids, that skill follows them. And then we give a grade based off of the competence in that skill. So that would be my first, be my first thought on that.
Yeah, I love that because it is something that we often talk about in terms of the transferability and the importance that these skills are universal across many subjects, and being able to make argument or analyze data or whatever the competency might be, and under the umbrella of critical thinking is sustainable. It's potentially transferable, and it's an opportunity to have students start to become those competencies. We often
Yeah.
talk about the idea that we don't want you to do critical thinking; we want you to become a critical thinker.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the key of moving students away from doing school to becoming that which they are learning, for sure.
Yeah.
Another strategy I really that jumped out at me when I read the book was this idea of a generative learning model
Sure.
for instruction. So, from your perspective, when you and Matt wrote the book, and thinking about what are some of the characteristics that you would recognize in a generative learning model, and as a teacher, how would I get started, doing
Yeah.
that, creating that in my classroom?
Yeah. So that concept isn't mine or Matt's.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
that generative learning concept comes from the book Make It Stick.
Hmm.
Peter Brown is the primary author on it. But that book kind of kickstarted this idea of maybe Madeline Hunter's gradual release model needs to be challenged a little bit,
Hmm.
right? Needs to be thought about where we do that, not as like everything we do all the time. So generative learning, what we do with that model is student does something first,
Hmm.
and then the teacher reacts to that. So there could be 30 seconds of thinking. It could be, writing a 2-paragraph, 1-page thing, and then using that to react, as evidence to react to and mold the learning after that. So it's really a student does first model. And I would say the more you can get students to do something before you teach and direct, the more they're going to have kind of a current state of learning to relate what you're saying to, right?
Hmm.
Otherwise, in when looking at the gradual release model, it has its place. We still do it, but the
Hmm.
bulk of our instruction is student does, and then teacher reacts to that evidence that's coming from that student, and then
Okay.
they're able to self-generate that initial step, which is what we liked about that theory of practice.
Hmm. Would you then contrast when talking about Madeline Hunter? I know that there's many of us who have nightmares about figuring out an anticipatory set and and closure.
Me
We're
too.
like, who has time for closure? Like, where does this come from? Oh, I've got 6 minutes left in the lesson. I've got more time than I needed. Okay, in conclusion, everyone, it doesn't happen. We know that.
Yeah.
But contrast for me the idea of the student does first with the anticipatory set. Is it that the anticipatory set is still teacher centered, and
Yeah.
that you see it as, is that the way you contrast those?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. The anticipatory set still seen to me,
Yeah.
means teacher centric still.
Okay. Okay. So
Sometimes it's too, sorry. Sometimes it's
no.
too like essential questiony, like there's, that it kind of sits in that world too.
Mhm.
And that, we want the kids doing something first, thinking, observing, writing, producing, doing something.
Mhm.
And that's the difference. So yeah, I would
Yeah.
agree. It's too
Yeah.
teacher centric.
Yeah. So having them generate their ideas, having them sort of get some experience, even some productive lack of success, productive failure,
Yeah.
as we often refer
Yeah.
to. Hey, that didn't work for me, or I didn't come up with a great idea, but now I'm going to immerse myself into that learning, for sure. So is it as simple as saying, if you want to begin, have them do something, have them put a provocative prompt on the screen,
Yeah.
or have them talk about something and just generate? It literally is generating those ideas, for sure.
Yeah. So I
Uh,
was sorry, I was just observing a teacher today, and he had a student does first prompt on the board.
mhm.
And it was, think about a conflict you recently had with someone and how you resolved it. And then they were writing that, thinking that, I forget how he had them produce it. I mean, they might have just been thinking it through, but then
Right.
after they did that, he opened up with, here's how this connects to today's, to what we're about to do. So taking that thinking, let's play with that. What did you think about? What was your
Right.
conflict? So it's kind of the inception point of the rest of the lesson, once you
Mhm.
get kids to do something first. And in my experience, it was a much more authentic way to teach, because I was reacting to what the kids' thinking was.
Right.
And I've said this before, I think as when we've done, talks together and things. I think the goal is for teachers to use the students' thinking to grow them with instead of theirs, if
Right.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, I want to use your thinking to grow you with. So get talking, get producing, so I can react and shape with your thinking.
Yeah.
And that is something that we tried to, get in the instruction part of the book, is we need to be more reactors than deliverers of information. So
It's a real theme in the book of putting students at the center. Certainly, it doesn't mean, and I think so often teachers misunderstand this idea of being student-centered, meaning it's almost as if it's a zero-sum game. The more centered the students are, the less involved I am, as opposed
right.
to understanding that they are partners and that we're trying to bring them into the fold. We still have our expertise, we still have our depth of experience, and we know how to get them there. But generating those ideas and getting their thinking flowing. I love that focus on conflict, because I think you look, there's so much that can be analyzed across history, and so much that's analyzed in current events today. There's conflict in all sorts of areas, and there's some common themes that emerge out of that. And again, you want to talk about transferability, or endurance, if you will, in terms of thinking. I love that. Another idea, Tony, in the book that I really loved was this focus on student-centered mission statements. Okay,
Sure.
so contrast for us the idea of a student-centered mission statement with a traditional mission statement. And then again, how do we go about developing one? Is it developed still by the educators if it's a student-centered, or do we have students working alongside of us to create this student-centered mission statement?
Yeah, I think the last thing you said, that's a great idea. That wasn't the meaning behind student-centric mission statements, but we do involve our students in our mission statement, vision statement development. The copy does go to student panels and parent panels to make sure that they have a voice in it. So that I think is a great idea. In the book, what we were referring to as far as student-centric mission statement is something that we see, and me in particular, it's kind of a pet peeve as I go to schools and talk, and I see a mission statement that says, at so-and-so school, we will develop students who do this. We will make this happen. And you can just see the adult-centric part of it, that students are almost like objects of the amazingness of the adults in the building. And whenever I get a chance to work on mission statements and vision statements with schools, I'll say it's not we will develop students who, it's our students are. That's a student-centric mission statement. So, our students are self-reliant. In bear country, the bears at the school are self-motivated, self-generated learners who can advocate for themselves. Period. No adult, no reference or insinuation that there's an adult involved. Even though we're there, we're the gardeners, right? But we want to make every bit of what we do in every crevice scream, it's about the student. So.
Yeah, you can really, I think for most schools, most listeners listening in right now, it's not malicious in its intent. It's not meant to necessarily be an ego-centric thing. It's just, I think for a lot of schools, it would be something that I have to admit, as I was reading the book, I'd never thought of that before. That was an idea that I never really thought about, framing the mission statement as being student-centered that way. I thought it was a really great idea. And certainly, so I think as listeners, you're listening to Tony talk about that. It's not about saying, oh, our mission statement is all about our being heroes and saviors.
No,
Not at all. I know you're not intending that.
No,
Tony.
I mean,
it's
just
really about,
a clarification. I'm glad you bring that up. A clarification on that is, it's not necessarily because we're doing what you're saying. It's because the idea of school has always been teacher delivers to kids.
Right.
So it's, teaching has been a teacher to student verb. And that's what trickles through there. I think it's just institutional, generational sort of understanding or concept of what teaching is that comes out in mission statements. And, I think, it's just our students would be a good place to start with that. That would be a good frame.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's I can see. I think about the schools I've worked in where that would be a great exercise to kind of turn the lens around and just
Mhm.
say, this is about our students and what they become, who they become, and we're there to help facilitate the conditions that make that possible. But we really center them in
Yeah.
the experience. Okay, as we finish up, Tony, I can't have you on the podcast and not talk about assessment, of course, because you and I have presented several times at the
Yeah.
same conferences on assessment, et cetera. But I want to go granular here because I think we often talk about assessment. You and I talk about assessment a lot, but I want to really go granular here because the book is called Small Changes, Big Impact. And one of the questions I often ask participants to consider in a workshop is what's the least you could do to bring about the greatest effect, right? So what's one really small thing that you can do that actually has a large impact? So I want to ask you that same question. What is the smallest change to your assessment and grading practices that you implemented that brought about the greatest effect in your classroom?
Yeah, if you want to get super granular,
Yep.
really the thing that I tried one time in 2009, I know the year because it was like a big like whoa.
Hmm.
I tried Gus, which is asking kids after each question if they guessed, were unsure, or sure on the
Hmm.
question before.
Okay.
Now the aha I had was I had 90% of my kids getting question one right, and then they were brutally honest with me saying, "Mr. Reibel, I had no clue I guessed." Right.
Yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
75% of my kids were guessing that first time. I'll never forget those numbers because it was just shocking to me
Right.
that I thought I was a pretty darn good teacher. And I was not taking into account the thinking, emotions, and relationships that were existing inside my classroom. So, what Gus represents to me when I talk about Gus and tell this story is making your assessments conversational and relational is probably the smallest change you can make on assessments that has a big impact because kids respect that. Like, oh, Mr. Reibel really wants to get to know me.
Mhm.
It's just not about answer A or, answering A on that question. He's asking me if I guess. That resonates with the kids internally that this teacher values who they are, and not that you don't, but it's a gesture of that, visible gesture to that to kids. And then I've branched off of that and I started saying, after half of an exam, I would pause them and say, just write 3 emotions that you're having right now in the margin. When you're done with that, go back to the test. I would write questions that sounded like I was asking it, not like define the 3 principles of. It was, yeah, last night I forgot what the 3 principles of this were. Can you remind me what they were? That's making it more humanistic and relational. We don't talk to people and relate to people like define the. It would be like you asking me these questions to me just going through bullet points. That would be a weird, a weird
Yeah.
conversation structure. So I think the small thing with assessment that I think went a long way for me, gave me good insight into who the kids were. It was things like Gus, like making it conversational and relational.
Mhm.
So
I think that goes back to something I say a lot, and a lot of I'm not alone in this, is that assessment is relationship building at its
mhm.
core. That's why I always bristle at these expressions like students have to Maslow before they can bloom and things like that. And I think you can Maslow through bloom. I think
Yeah,
that through
yeah,
the instruction, through the assessment, you're going to build those relationships because you show that
for
at the
sure.
core, at the core of the experience is their learning, and how you handle their learning, how you handle assessment tells them a lot about
Yeah,
what matters to you and the fact that they matter to you.
yeah, I
I
would
love
totally
that. I
agree.
love that
Totally
idea
agree.
of engineering those conversations for sure. Fantastic. This has been great, Tony. We've got 2 questions as we finish up,
Sure.
always on the podcast. These are questions I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. I know you've heard a few of these as well. You can take this in any direction you want to, but the first one
Okay.
is educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
Uh, Besides AP tests,
That keep everybody up at night, right?
yeah, yeah. I would say it's something. It's still pretty consistent, and I think it's making assumptions about. Did we make assumptions about kids learning, and did it distort a kid's self concept?
Mhm.
Like if we don't get all the evidence and have relational conversations and show that they matter, we might be making assumptions about what the kid can do and who they are. And that then could potentially lead to them, internalizing some sort of distorted sense of self. And that is why I do what I do, and why I think that keeps me up at night. Like, do our teachers, without Gus, I was making assumptions, right? Without that Gus practice, I was making assumptions about my kids. And I still think back about those moments like, gosh, how many kids did I make an assumption about because I wasn't acting in a relational way? So that still keeps me up at night, because have we done everything? Is the school I'm working with doing that, or is my colleague, or did I do that enough, or did I say that the right way when it comes to not making assumption about kids learning? Because I think that's urgent and critical.
Right.
So
those assumptions, they always seem to get us in trouble. I've said for years that one of the most egregious things adults do is take kids at face value and just sort of make assumptions about what you witness, as opposed to accessing that information. And the fact that we go back to that previous question about conversation, assessment as conversation gets you insight, allows you to understand more intimately where a student is at. So assumptions are always a dangerous game, if you will, in education, for sure. Last question as we finish up today, Tony. It's a question about success, your personal definition of success. If a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what's your definition of success, how would you answer them?
Self-managed life, self-reliance, self-managed life. It's what I want for my two boys. I have a 15-year-old. He's going through high school right now. I want him to live his own life and fly and sustain and set goals. And to me, that's a self-managed life. So I said it earlier in the podcast. It's what I'll say time and time again. I think that is success. I don't think there's a benchmark for, different things. I think it's just, can someone self-sustain to the point where they feel satisfied with their life?
Yeah, I love that. I think I think that would be a success for anybody, if you're able to live the life and guide your life and manage your life and just live the life that you want to live. Absolutely. Listeners, you definitely can follow Tony on Twitter. The Twitter handle is @Reibel, all lowercase. Instagram is @Reibel22. You'll find Tony on Facebook and LinkedIn. And also websites, www.ebgschools.org. That's evidence-based grading, ebgschools.org. Tony, quickly tell us a little bit about that site. What will listeners find on that site?
Yeah, you'll find it's a new site, but it's schools who are implementing evidence-based grading with a lot of these practices we talked about here today. So I started earlier this year kind of saying, hey, how far along are you in your journey? Is there anything you want to share with the larger community of standards-based grading and evidence-based grading? So it's just, my attempt to just get some sharing going. And I think we've got, I think there's like 7 different states on there, and they've sent links in for connection to the resource. So hopefully you find it valuable.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm sure listeners will get a lot of valuable information about implementation, different strategies, because we know implementing evidence-based grading is not a singular activity. There's a lot of different directions you can go and choices you get to make. The bad news is there's choices you have to make. The good news is there's choices you get to make. So I love the fact that you've put that together. Fantastic. We'll have links for all of that in the show notes, listeners, for you to connect there. Tony, great to have you here today. Thanks for doing this, man. I appreciate it.
Always nice seeing you, Tom, talking to you. It's always inspiring. So good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Hopefully we'll see you soon.
Yep. Take care.